John Prine, I was a teenager, probably 16 or 17 years old, sitting on the chair in the living room there in Homewood, Illinois, reading the Chicago Daily News like I did every day at about 4 o'clock when the paper would hit the door. And I read the article, Singing Mailman Delivers. And I thought,
Roger Ebert,
this guy seems really interesting. And didn't think much of it. And then I saw his record. I used to go to a jukebox supplier that would get 45s in that you could buy 3 for $1. And some genius at Atlantic Records had decided to put out a jukebox single of Sam Stone as the A-side, and the B-side was his song Blue Umbrella, which to me is still a great country song. The first record just kind of blew me away. And then I was down here in Nashville writing with various people. So when Prine got here at first, we'd see each other at various events. And at one point I stopped writing for places like ATV and Tree and those kind of companies, and had decided to work with Bug Music. And I met Al Bonetta, and I've been writing with Keith Whitley, and we'd written a song about a double-wide trailer in a satellite dish. And Prine heard me singing that at some showcase we did. He goes, well, let's get together and try to write, come out to the house. So one afternoon I drove there, and we sat around, and he says, you got anything? I go, I got a really, really dumb idea. He goes, that's fun. Let's start with that. What is it? I go, it's Let's Talk Dirty in Hawaii. Waka Waka Nukalika. He goes, oh, man. And he was into it because, John loved wordplay. And we just had the greatest time. He had gone to Hawaii and gotten a little bitty paperback thing called Instant Hawaiian, which we flipped through for about 20 minutes before realizing that there was no Hawaiian that we needed. It was better to just make it all up. And got probably a couple verses in, and he says, oh, man, let's go somewhere. We wound up riding over to a Close Quarters, which at the time was sort of the songwriters' hangout, and they had a patio with a brick wall in front of it, and we're sitting there at a table, and there's Harlan Howard over here, and there's this guy there, and, here's Prine and I going, gimme, Okadoka. And German Afternoons was about to come out, and he just loved it so much, it's like, stop the presses. And the next thing I knew, he put it out as a single on green vinyl, and he's got T-shirts and all this stuff, and the Dirt Band cut a version of it, and then somebody else was going to do a version of it, but it just never quite found the audience. But, we could go on YouTube right now and probably watch 100 different people ranging from a Welsh group of nuns, okay?
Are you being serious?
Yeah, I'm being dead serious. To just people who, all doing their versions, little ukulele groups, your grandmother and grandmother are sitting there singing that song. And that was probably more influenced by songs like Ukulele Lady. I was a big fan of Jim Kweskin and those kind of material novelty songs from the 20s, and waiting for that Hawaiian craze to kick back in. John Prine would come off stage every night that I opened shows for him or traveled with him or was around him, go into his dressing room, and the local promoter would bring him homemade meatloaf and mashed potatoes, and he would sit there by himself. And until he finished, and after he'd finished that meal, then he'd come out and meet the crowd, which everybody wanted to, let me build you a log cabin, let me take you to here. His fans ranged from Vietnam vets to crazy beatniks, the same sort of thing. He was always thinking. You could just almost watch his mind spinning, going, okay, we got something coming here. Those guys are once in a lifetime writers. I was so lucky to get to work with him and Shell and a bunch of other folks like that who really loved the craft and just the sheer fun of it. Wasn't a competition. It was more, like a really good game of Scrabble. And you did not want to play Scrabble with John Prine because he would kick your ass from here to tomorrow. Okay. And I've heard that from more than one participant. And, after we wrote Let's Talk Dirty, he'd go, I got some smelt, come on over. Stuff like that. He was such a Chicago, Kentucky kind of a guy. I mean, talk about down to earth and treated everybody the same. There was never any of that. I'm John Prine and you're not. I never picked up on that vibe. And, letting people like myself open shows or Todd Snyder, he was real good at matching his music up, all the stuff he did with all those great female singers, Iris, and, it was just, it was always fresh. And John had a great team around him, but with Al and all those people, they really struck me as being folks who would have really done anything to fulfill his wildest dreams, which is all you can ask for. My friend John Bader designed the Oh Boy Records logo on a napkin one day. He's another Indiana, and he and John were both into Cadillacs. And the last time Bader saw John was at Rotier's here in Nashville, which is now closed. And John had 10 cars he was driving around because the band was going this way and that way, and seemed to be having a really big time before, the COVID hit and all that. That was such a crazy thing. God knows where he'd be today or what kind of songs he'd been writing. I hate to think of what we missed.
Did you ever get to go to any of his poker games?
No, I'm not a poker player. I've heard of these. They're legend. He and various traveling buddies would often sit up playing cards late into the night. I just never. I knew that I'd be the guy leaving broke.
Surprised they didn't invite you then.
Oh, there's Robert Earl Keane and those guys. They had a whole good, every festival that they were at, they couldn't wait to get the game started. This is an ongoing thing. I would have loved to have seen games with Towns and Guy and Robert Earl when they were touring together. That must have been some great moments. I've heard stories about that. And I toured his town some, and you hear all this story. I got a picture of him up here on the wall and all that. I first met him pretty soon after the first people I met in Nashville in the first week, and I hitchhiked here through Indianapolis because I was in Champaign. Towns, he and I had many mutual friends from both Texas and from his being around here. And I had known his records on Poppy Records and things like that, and seen him around town. And he'd be at a party, and one time he'd be trying to play the saxophone. Next time he might be trying to play the violin. Luckily, there's not too many recordings extant of either of these activities, but he'd just, always shock and surprise. So he were doing a tour of Vermont and New Hampshire. It was the Coolidge Tour, is what we called it, because every single town had a place called the Coolidge. And we'd be having breakfast, and Towns could go for just, long conversations about the Custer battlefield. And just odd stuff. I later learned after he'd passed that Towns had attended a military school basically in Illinois up around Barrington when he was in high school. That guy, I used to see him over at Jack Clemens because that was like one of the places you'd stop by, and there'd always be Rooney and, that whole crowd there, and Towns would be around. And just to have been here during that time when you could go to Bishop's Corner, which was a bar off of West End here, and there'd be Skinny Dennis and Towns and Guy and Dave Only, and just, we're all there passing the hat, hope we can afford a hamburger. And Towns was the one, well, Guy and Towns at least had publishing deals and records coming out and things like that, but nobody was getting rich and pulling up in the limousine. We were just lovers of good songs, and Steve Young was part of that whole scene around there. I mean, it was just a really interesting time. And Music Row was 16th, 17th Avenue, and a few side streets. And I didn't even have a car for the first couple of years here, so I was the tall, skinny walking guy going up and down Music Row to, pitch a song here or write something there. And we'd all get at Mac's Cafe, at least 2 or 3 days a week, because they had all-you-can-eat vegetables, which is another reason why I'm still here today. Without that, I probably would have been gone the first month. They talk about Paris in the 30s. When I think back on it, that was probably the vibe, more so. But we were so involved with day-to-day survival and all that. It wasn't, and everyone knew, I knew my favorite Guy Clark songs from sitting across from or listening to him play these things. And he may have known 1 or 2 of mine. And we all kind of knew each other's work. So if we heard that Conway Twitty was doing a record, we might go, that song you wrote, you really ought to take that over. Then there wasn't any competition where, this has got to be a secret. We can't let Garth hear this first. All that kind of that has radically changed as far as I can tell.
You mentioned Skinny Dennis.
Yeah.
Did you know him very well?
I knew he was really skinny. He was very frail. He was a good bass player. And he was part of that sort of Anderson Fair, Houston scene that all those guys sort of came out of, Foley, and God, there were so many good writers there. They were different from the Kerrville crowd because they were, to me, a lot more literate than folky-oriented. Even though the folkies were still here, it was a different vibe completely. And you go down to Bishop's and they'd be waiting their turn if everybody else to go up there and pass the hat and hope you made enough money to buy a cheeseburger.
He's a mysterious figure that people don't usually have very many stories about. So
there were so many of those guys that they were, there were these 2 brothers who wore fur coats and Russian hats, the Thompson twins, who would stand at the roundabout on Music Row and just be completely weirded out of it. I mean, just completely odd. It was a wonderful time for those kind of people coming here thinking, I'm going to be a country star, And, people like Fred Foster with his label, where he was promoting songwriters and changing the whole face of what was going on.